Wikipedia has become a staple of the internet, an important place to quickly find out information, and the starting point of many rabbit holes. By exploring the depths of the online encyclopedia, people can learn about creepy and strange events, theories, and people that they may never have heard of otherwise. Number 10. A Wikipedia page with some disturbing imagery is that of the creepy phenomenon of rat kings. Even people without a fear of rodents would be disturbed by the sight of half a dozen rats tied together by their tails and panicking as they scramble to survive. Put simply, rat kings are a group of rats whose tails have become tangled together. This is often with the help of oil secreted from the rats, ice, or food. How this happens naturally is still something that scientists are still only theorizing about, as very few living specimens are discovered. Rat kings have been witnessed by people since at least the 1500s. Most of the early specimens originated in Germany, where a strange mythology about the creatures developed. It was said that a rat leader demanded that his subjects create a throne for him to sit on. The lesser rats become a tangled mess and suffer so that the leader can show his strength and power by sitting atop them. It's likely not a coincidence that this myth originated in the same place and time as the German Reformation and rebellions against the Church. Martin Luther himself described the Pope as the king of the rats right at the top. While it's unlikely that rat kings are created under the instruction of some powerful rat leader, they are a real and disturbing sight. There are countless stories of people stumbling across piles of rats knotted together. Some rat kings are made up of 3 or 4 individuals. The largest was recorded by Guinness World Records as being made up of 32 individuals. It was discovered in the German town of Buchheim in May of 1828. A man named Miller Steinbruck was cleaning out his chimney when the clumped up and partially mummified remains fell into his fireplace. This specimen is one of around half a dozen that are kept in museums today. There were once more specimens, but as these were normally held in museums in Germany, many were destroyed during the Second World War. It's believed many of the so-called rat kings would have been man-made. In 1883, a zoologist tried to prove that rat kings were not a hoax by creating one himself. He found that the man-made knots were very different from the rat king specimens that had been discovered, and believed it was impossible for humans to have been responsible for these strange creatures. But rat kings reached their height of popularity in an era when zoological hoaxes weren't uncommon. For example, in 1822, P.T. Barnum purchased what was described as a mermaid, which was believed to be the torso and head of a juvenile monkey, sewn onto a fish. As rat kings became the subject of fascination, it would be easy to take the bodies of rats that had already passed away and tangle their tails together. There are a few theories about how rat kings could be created naturally. Almost all known examples of this creepy phenomenon involve black rats, which have prehensile tails. It's believed that groups of rats will huddle together for warmth during cold periods, and their tails reflexively wrap around one another. When a rat realizes it's trapped, it tries to pull away, which only makes the knot stronger. The presence of oil secreted from the rats' bodies and other bodily fluids would only make the knot even harder to break free of. It would be impossible for rats to survive for long as part of a rat king. Most would try to remove their own tails before succumbing to a lack of food. X-rays of specimens have shown broken tails, but some have also had calluses, which suggest that they've been tangled together for an extended period of time. Encounters with rat kings are rare today, but there have been recorded specimens in places as far away as Russia and New Zealand. It's possible that there are many more instances of these disturbing creatures in places out of view to humans. Number 9. Between 1990 and 1995, violent crime in the US reached its peak and has been rapidly declining ever since. The same can be seen in countries around the world. In 2000, scientists noticed the similarities between the growth and decline in violent crime and the charts related to lead exposure. This would lead to the disturbing lead crime hypothesis that's still being debated today. Humans have known about the negative effects of lead for centuries. Over time, we've come to realize just how little lead is needed to cause damage, and just how many ways lead can be ingested without even realizing it. By far, the most damaging source of lead in recent decades was in leaded gasoline, which was first invented in the 1920s and became immensely popular over the next few decades. Even at the time, there was some skepticism about the safety of this new substance, and workers at a plant producing the stuff had to be treated for lead poisoning. But its benefits to the car and engine were too great for it to be taken off the shelves. It also was thought that a small amount of lead wouldn't do too much damage. In the 1970s, new guidelines indicated that 40 micrograms per deciliter was a safe amount of blood lead levels. We now know even less than 5 micrograms can be dangerous. Lead poisoning can lead to damage to the parts of the brain that deal with decision-making, emotional regulation, and impulse control. There's evidence that suggests that long-term exposure to lead can lead to aggression and lower intelligence. According to the lead crime hypothesis, people who were born and grew up in an era where leaded gasoline was common likely suffered from long-term lead poisoning. This had such a damaging effect on their minds that by the time they reached adulthood, they'd begun to walk down a path of delinquency and criminality. By comparing graphs of lead levels in the atmosphere to crime levels, there seemed to be a clear correlation. The two curves are offset by roughly 20 years when children who'd grown up with these lead levels reached adulthood. The lead levels reached a peak around 1970, when leaded petrol and lead paint were finally banned. This lined up perfectly with the violent crime peak in 1990. When lead levels decreased, crime levels decreased 20 years later. Those who believe the lead crime hypothesis claim that it's not simply a case of correlation. When different areas phased out lead at different times or at different rates, this was reflected in the crime levels for those areas. It was also seen in other countries such as the UK. The scientific reasons for why lead might cause an increase in crime also seem to suggest this isn't simply coincidental. There is a logical reason why this might be the case. Skeptics have pointed out some problems with this theory, though. The correlation isn't universal, and the rise in violent crime is completely missing in places such as Japan. In other countries like Mexico, it's clearly not the main factor. When looking closer at the ages of the perpetrators of these violent crimes, it showed that violent crime went up in all age groups 20 years after the rise in lead, rather than just in the younger generations, suggesting exposure to lead might not have been the dominant factor at play. Research into lead crime hypothesis is going on, and it's clear that other factors are definitely involved. But it's eerie to think what other things might be missed due to an offset between cause and effect. Number 8. At an altitude of roughly 8,500 meters on Mount Everest's northeast ridge, there's a small alcove sheltered from the wind and harshest conditions. The majority of climbing parties that take the northern route to the summit will stop here to rest and regain their energy before the final push. But when they leave the cave, one of the people sheltering there is left behind. He's been resting there for years and is now one of the most famous bodies on Mount Everest. The individual is known as Green Boots, named after the bright green boots that lie in the path. He's been in the alcove since 1996, when a climbing disaster led to him and 2 other party members losing their lives on the mountain. Green Boots' Wikipedia article gives 2 possible identities for this man, both from the Indo-Tibetan Border Police expedition, who were attempting to become the first Indian expedition to reach the summit from the north. Its most likely identity for Green Boots is Sawang Paljor. Sawang was born in a farming family in the village of Sakti, a community where everyone knew everyone. He was interested in climbing at an early age, and when he left school, he decided to combine his interests and work. He joined the Indo-Tibetan Border Police, a group that monitors and protects the northern border between India and China. It was a job that involved a lot of climbing, and Sawang climbed many mountains during his training and while on the job. He reached the rank of head constable, and in 1996 was chosen for the ITBP Everest expedition. Sawang was very proud to be a part of the expedition, especially when he was chosen along with 3 other men to be the first group to attempt to summit. There were a few problems with the expedition, though. On May 10th, the group woke late and there was worry that they wouldn't be able to make it to the summit and back before nightfall. The expedition leader instructed the 4 men who were to set out to make their way back at 3 p.m. at the latest. Sawang Paljor was joined by Sawang Smanla and Dorje Morup, who were both from the same region as Paljor, and deputy leader Harbinjan Singh. The main objective was to fix ropes for a later attempt, as they'd started their climb late, but it's believed summit fever came over 3 of the 4 men. Harbhajan was lagging behind the others, and when he called that it was time for them to turn back, they didn't respond. Harbhajan was suffering from frostbite and felt like he had no choice but to leave his companions. Hours passed and a blizzard blew in. Harbhajan and the others grew worried, but then they received a radio message saying that the group had reached the summit. They then began the trek back down the mountain, but it seemed like the storm became too much for the 3 men. A Japanese expedition heading to the summit the following day passed one of the men, believed to be Dorje Morab. They were unaware of just how much Dorje was struggling, so they simply helped him with his ropes and continued on their way. They would later pass other bodies, causing controversy about whether they could have helped or not. It's believed Green Boots is either Sewang Paljor or Dorje Morab. Neither were ever recovered from the mountain slopes. What happened in their last hours will remain a mystery, but they likely tried to find shelter from the cold before passing away in the extreme conditions. While Green Boots is the most famous, around 200 people remain on Everest. It's too costly and too risky for bodies to be recovered from the slopes. In 2017, Green Boots allegedly disappeared, and there were rumors that he'd been removed to a more discreet location so that he could rest in peace. But there were later reports that he was still in the alcove, now named Green Boots Cave, serving as both a landmark and a chilling reminder to all those trying to reach the summit. Number 7. There have been many floods throughout recent history, which didn't consist of water. One of the strangest from more recent times is accounted for in an article on the Wisconsin Butter Fire. The Great Butter Fire took place in May of 1991. Nobody was seriously hurt in the incident, but it was the largest commercial fire in Wisconsin state history, and could have resulted in an environmental disaster. The blaze started on the afternoon of May 3rd at the Central Storage and Warehouse Complex in Madison. This was one of the company's largest facilities, and it was in high demand at the time. A policy meant that the US government was purchasing excess cheese and other dairy products in an effort to keep the prices stable. Knowing that there was a guaranteed buyer for the products, this led to farmers overproducing things such as butter. Facilities like the one in Madison were utilized to keep the government dairy products, which were later distributed. As well as butter, the warehouse contained processed meat, baked goods, and anhydrous ammonia, which is sometimes used as an antimicrobial agent. The fire was first noticed in an area near the refrigerators in one of the buildings, where a forklift was idling. It's believed that a short circuit on the forklift caused the initial spark, which rapidly grew. With so much flammable material for the fire to feed on, it wasn't long before it had spread through much of the building. Firefighters were called to try to contain the flames, but it wasn't long before they spread to other buildings in the facility. Nearby homes were evacuated, and a nearby highway was temporarily closed. There was a fear some of the chemicals stored at the facility could erupt or send toxic gas out over the community. The ammonia was a real concern, but if it came into contact with an acid that was also stored in the facility, it would cause significant damage. Thankfully, nothing so dramatic happened, but the butter still proved to be a real problem for firefighters. One of the walls of the facility collapsed, sending a wave of butter and lard out into the environment. It was up to 5 feet deep in places, and the fire trucks couldn't move in or out of the location. Fuel trucks also couldn't reach the engines. Firefighters had to wade through the slippery river, carrying gallons of fuel with them to make sure the engines kept running. Water only made the butter even more viscous and caused problems trying to contain it. Melted butter would have had the same effect as petroleum oil if it had gotten into the environment. A nearby stream fed directly into Lake Monona, home to many species of fish. The Environmental Agency worked quickly to form dams to stop the butter from reaching the river. Instead, it was pumped into 2 stormwater discharge ponds, where it could be properly cleaned up. After several days, the fire was put out, and the cleanup work began in earnest. Meat and butter were transported to landfills, and after 2 weeks, the Environmental Agency declared the cleanup a success. Nobody had been seriously hurt, though one firefighter was treated for exhaustion. There also seemed to be little damage to the local wildlife, with only a few fish apparently impacted by the butter flood. It would take years for the facility to be rebuilt. According to firefighters, most of the uniforms worn that day had to be destroyed. and the smell of butter lingered in the hoses for years afterward. Number 6. The city of Guanajuato has many colorful and vibrant attractions, but the most eerie and unsettling location in the city is possibly the most popular. The Mummies of Guanajuato have been attracting tourists since the late 1800s and still amaze and instill horror in visitors today. At the beginning of the 19th century, a cholera pandemic swept through much of the world, including Mexico. Countless people lost their lives, and in many places, the cemeteries couldn't keep up with the burials. In Guanajuato, many people were buried in above-ground tombs, which were described as looking like bookcase cubbies. In 1865, the local government required the family members to pay an annual burial tax to keep their loved ones buried in the tombs. If a family missed payments for 3 years, or if there was no family to pay the tax, the remains were disinterred. At first, cemetery workers expected they would be retrieving bones, but the hot and dry conditions, as well as the soil minerals in some cases, had preserved the remains. Unsure of what to do with these mummified people, the best preserved of these were stored in an underground ossuary, beneath the cemetery itself. It wasn't long before the local people learned of this morbid location and started to pay cemetery workers a few pesos to look inside. As more mummies were disinterred, the ossuary became an official attraction. With over 100 mummies, the site was transformed into a museum and began to welcome tourists to see the disturbing mummies. When the people had originally been buried, little embalming had taken place. That meant that the jaws of many of the mummies fell open at some point after they passed. It gives the impression of an eternal silent scream, adding to the already creepy effect of the natural mummification. The mummies have attracted many visitors, including the writer Ray Bradbury. Bradbury later claimed that the experience was terrifying, and he had dreams of being trapped in the halls of the museum. The experience inspired his short story, The Next Line In. Over time, the name tags that were attached to each mummy were stolen by visitors who wanted to take a special souvenir home. As many had nothing else to identify them with, this left a void which folklore filled in. Many stories were created and attached to individual mummies, including one that was described as being a watch, and others that were claimed to be desperados. In reality, these were ordinary people who'd spent their lives in the city that they're now displayed beneath. Some have argued that the mummies have been mistreated over the years. They haven't always been kept in the best conditions and were sometimes sent to conventions in other parts of Mexico. In recent years, work has begun to better preserve the mummies and to try to figure out the identities of these individuals. Researchers have been going over records from the 19th and 20th centuries to try to come up with names. DNA analysis of teeth and bones may also help to give identities to these mysterious figures. Staff at the museum have said that if the descendants of any of the mummies wish for their relative to be removed from the display, this will happen immediately. Another worry is that fungal colonies located in some of the mummies could cause health problems for modern visitors. These mummies are today kept behind glass cases, but these aren't airtight. Number 5. Eben Byers was a socialite and sportsman from the turn of the 20th century. He likely would have wanted to be remembered for his golfing career or the work he did as chairman of his father's company. Unfortunately for him, Byers is today remembered for a disturbing illness and a legacy that changed the way radium cure-alls were regulated. Eben was the son of an industrialist born in 1880. He attended Yale College where he played polo and was part of the university's golf team. From 1900, he was a regular feature in the U.S. Amateur Championship, finishing second 2 years in a row and taking the title in 1906. He was destined for a job at his father's company and would eventually be made chairman of the A.M. Byers Company. It should have been a relatively easy life for Eben, fitting his work around his social life and amateur golfing career. But things changed drastically for him in November of 1927, as he made his way home from watching the annual Yale-Harvard football game. The train he was traveling in came to a sudden stop, and Eben fell out of the bed where he was resting. He landed on his arm, causing pain that didn't go away. Eben sought help from a physiotherapist, who prescribed Radithor. Radithor was a medicine created by William J.A. Bailey. Bailey was a Harvard University dropout and a known fraud. He'd served time in prison and paid fines for fraud before. That didn't stop him from pretending he was a doctor and selling his patented Radithor, a cure-all for minor ailments. The active ingredient in radithor was radium, a radioactive element that had only been discovered a few decades earlier. Radium emitted alpha, beta, and gamma radiation, but at the time, the dangers of this substance weren't understood. Outside of the body, alpha particles are the least dangerous. They cannot pass through the skin. But that also means that once inside the body, they can't escape. Radium is even more dangerous because of its similarities in makeup to the element calcium, which is in the same group on the periodic table. That means that when ingested, radium is deposited in the same place calcium would be, the bones. Eben was unaware of the dangers and took radithor as the doctor instructed, after every meal. Over the next 3 years, he consumed 1,400 bottles of the medicine. At first, he believed it helped his pain and made him feel more youthful. He would gift packages of the drink to friends and even feed it to his racehorse. But over time, the side effects became obvious. He had crippling headaches and lost a lot of weight. Then his jaw began to disintegrate. Eben was suffering from a condition called radium jaw, the same thing that had afflicted the infamous Radium girls. These were female workers at factories creating watches with glow-in-the-dark hands. The workers would lick the ends of their radium-coated paintbrushes to get a thin point so that they could paint the intricate details on the watches. Like in the case of the Radium girls, Eben had to have most of his jaw removed, but it wouldn't be enough to stop the spread of radium in his body. During a Federal Trade Commission investigation into radithor, a lawyer was sent to Eben's home to take his statement. Eben was too ill to leave his home. The lawyer was horrified by what he saw, saying that a more gruesome experience in a more gorgeous setting would be hard to imagine. Bailey's business was shut down by the FTC, and radium became a substance monitored by the FDA, but it all came too late for Eben Byers. Eben passed away due to multiple cancers in his body and was buried in a lead-lined coffin. When his body was exhumed years later, scientists discovered that he was twice as radioactive as first thought. Radium has a half-life of 1,600 years, so it'll be a long time before this part of Eben's legacy fades away. Number 4. In 1831, fishermen off the coast of Sicily witnessed something extraordinary. The water itself seemed to be boiling, and schools of fish floated to the surface. A column of water and smoke erupted from the sea, bringing with it a strange island and an international dispute. Beneath the surface of the Mediterranean Sea, the underwater volcano, Empedocles, lies dormant. The volcano is fed by the destruction of the African continental plate, as it's pushed beneath the Eurasian plate. Every now and again, some of that magma is pushed to the surface. Empedocles doesn't have a single volcanic conduit. Magma pushes up to the surface where it can create small cones. The material that erupts hardens, making it harder for magma to reach the surface in that place again. Empedocles is dotted with small cones and scars of old eruptions. The most recent of these was once Graham Island. Fishermen were the first to witness Graham Island rise above the surface on July 13, 1831. It was little more than a dark hillock, reaching a few feet above sea level. Over the next few weeks, the island grew, reaching a maximum size of just 2 miles in diameter and 160 feet high. The small size didn't stop it from being an attractive piece of land. Its location was close to a number of shipping routes that traveled from Western Europe and the Atlantic Ocean to the Middle East. Controlling this island could help to control traffic or provide a port for privateers to attack enemy merchant ships. There was also a theory that this was just the beginning of a new chain of islands that would connect Sicily and Tunisia, which would completely change sailing in the Mediterranean forever. It lay just outside the territorial waters of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, the country that encompassed most of southern Italy. It also sat between mainland Sicily and the small volcanic island of Pantelleria. For King Ferdinand II of Two Sicilies, it was obviously a new piece of his kingdom. On July 17th, a Sicilian customs official landed on the newly formed island, claiming it for the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, and naming it Ferdinandia. There were plans to build a private resort there, and tourists began to flock to see this mysterious island. Of course, Sicily wasn't the only country interested in expanding its territory. On August 2nd, a British Royal Navy ship landed on the island, and the captain planted the British flag. He claimed the new island for Britain and named it Graham Island, after the First Lord of the Admiralty. French sailors also landed on the island and sent geologists to learn more about it. The geologist reported that it was made from scoria rocks, a very fragile material that could be quickly eroded by the wind and waves. It was clear to geologists that the island wasn't going to last long, but that didn't stop the French from also claiming it. Spain also expressed territorial ambitions related to the island. As the dispute about who should own the island continued, it soon began to sink back beneath the sea. In January of 1832, it completely disappeared, putting an end to the dispute. Today, it lies just 6 meters below sea level and still appears on shipping charts as it poses a potential hazard. In 2000 and 2002, there were concerns that the dispute may be reignited by strange activity surrounding the island. For a short time, it looked as if it might resurface, and the fight between Italy and Britain would resume. Thankfully for all involved, it didn't resurface, and it's unlikely that Graham Island, or Ferdinandia, ever will. Number 3. There are many unusual and unique buildings in New York City, but perhaps one of the strangest is one that looks dull from the outside. 33 Thomas Street, otherwise known as the Long Lines Building, has perplexed passers-by for decades. It's only recently that people have begun to see behind the windowless exterior. That exterior would be the first thing most notice about this strange building. The 550-foot tall skyscraper in the Tribeca neighborhood of Manhattan has no windows, other than those at the entrance. The exterior is covered in concrete panels and flame-treated granite faces in a brutalist style. There are no lights, and at night, the featureless buildings blend into the night sky. The name Long Lines doesn't come from anything about the architecture, but from the official purpose of the building. It was built in 1969 and 1974 for the AT&T Long Lines Department. It contained switchboards for long-distance telephone lines. The equipment not only needed a lot of space, but it also needed a lot of security. This was considered essential infrastructure, and work was done to ensure the building could sustain a direct radiation attack. As well as having its own backup generators and supplies that meant it could go off the grid for 2 weeks, it also had food and water stores so that the employees could last that long too. Even as many of the original services were moved to other facilities, 33 Thomas Street has remained an important part of the AT&T network. It contains data center processing systems. Some people believe that the lack of windows is simply down to the fact that they're not needed. Windows would also be a point of weakness in the event of some kind of blast. Even the strongest glass would be much weaker than concrete. But others believe that the lack of glass has more to do with hiding whatever is inside the building from outside observers. This theory was added to in 2023 when a steam fitter contracted to install wires and pipes in the building revealed that there were certain rooms his company weren't allowed into. They instead had to wire around these off-limits areas and couldn't even know why they weren't allowed inside. The anonymous worker also claims that the company found classified documents in one of the building's 3 basement levels, which contained instructions on what to do with the machines in the case of a radiation attack. After the release of the Snowden files, it seemed that there was some confirmation that the National Security Agency had connections to 33 Thomas Street. The documents described a massive surveillance hub, codenamed Titan Point, which was being used to monitor communications from international organizations and foreign countries. The Long Lines Building isn't named specifically, but the similarities between the Titan Point building and 33 Thomas Street have led to many suspecting that they are the same location. It may be a long time before we get the truth about 33 Thomas Street. It could be that the mysterious building may once have been hiding something, but has since fallen out of favor due to the amount of attention it's received. Alternatively, that could be the perfect cover for whatever is really going on inside. Number 2. There are many Arctic explorations recorded in the history books that have an air of mystery and wonder surrounding them. Few are as disturbing as the Crocker Island expedition, which was built on a lie and featured what one explorer called the most deplorable tragedy in the annals of Arctic exploration. Even 7 years before the expedition left, Arctic explorer Robert Peary had written about a mysterious island located in the far northern reaches of the world. Peary had just returned from an expedition to reach the North Pole, but had been forced to turn back less than 200 miles from his target. He was hoping to start a new expedition with the same aim, but needed funding. The plan was to get some of that funding from banker George Crocker, who'd been a backer of Peary's previous expedition. So when he claimed to have discovered an island north of Greenland, he named it after the banker. Unfortunately for Peary, Crocker had committed his money to the rebuilding of San Francisco after the Great Fire, and Peary would have to get funds from elsewhere. Peary managed to achieve those funds, and in 1909 finally reached the North Pole. He believed he was the first person to accomplish this, but when he returned to America, he discovered Frederick Cook, claiming to have reached the pole a year earlier. Looking at Cook's maps revealed he would have sailed directly through Crocker Island. If it could be proven that that island existed, Cook would be revealed as a fraud. Donald McMillan was one of Peary's supporters and decided to organize an expedition to clear up the matter once and for all. The expedition set off for Greenland, where they would make a base before going off in search of the island and conducting other scientific research. The expedition got off to a bad start when the original ship crashed while trying to avoid an iceberg. After they arrived in Greenland, the party was hit by diseases and the difficult conditions, which left many exhausted. Even with the help of local Inuit guides, it was difficult to survive. In the end, only 4 men were part of the group that would reach the edge of the Arctic Ocean and set off across the sea ice. These were McMillan himself, Fitzhugh Green, and 2 Inuit men named Pugatog and Ityukusak. On the 21st of April, 1914, the group caught sight of an island on the northwest horizon. McMillan claimed that they could see it without the use of telescopes, and it featured hills, valleys, and snow-capped peaks. At first, all 4 men were excited, but Pugatog said that he didn't believe the island to be real. He called it Pujok, or mist, a type of mirage. But the 2 Americans insisted on trying to reach the island. After 7 days, the group had to accept that the island wasn't real. The landscape had changed, and where once stood an island, there was now nothing. The group turned back, making it to solid land just before the sea ice started to break up. They then split into 2 groups so as to better map the area. Green and Pugatog were sent off together with food and water for 3 days. 6 days passed before Green came back, alone. He confessed to McMillan that he'd taken Pugatog's life. They'd been caught in a blizzard and then argued about which way to go. Pugatog wanted to go back and tried to slip away with their dog sledge and supplies. Green had attacked him before he could be abandoned. The truth was kept a secret from the other Inuit members of the group, and the Americans had a bigger problem as they couldn't find a way home. Multiple rescue attempts were made, with each ship getting trapped in the ice. Eventually, the Americans managed to make it home via dog sledge, bringing with them new insights into what life was like that far north, and confirmation that Crocker Land did exist. Number 1. The uncanny valley effect is something that many people have heard of, but our understanding of just what it is and why humans experience it has only recently started to be researched. The term was first coined in 1970, though the phenomenon had been recognized for a long time. Roboticist Masahiro Mori first coined the term in a paper published that year to describe something he'd noticed in his robotics work. He talked about how he'd always had an uneasy feeling around dolls and wax figures growing up. Now, with the new development of artificial hands, he was getting the same uneasy feeling. Mori found that the more human-like something was, the more humans would feel positive towards that thing, but only up to a point. When the robot, doll, or figure was almost human, but not quite, humans were left feeling disturbed or even disgusted by the figure. When plotted on a graph, it caused a valley-like dip. The phrase was brought into the English-speaking world by Josiah Reichardt in the book Robots, Facts, Fiction, and Prediction in 1978. But it wasn't until around the year 2000 that the phenomenon was properly studied. Different studies have found some key differences in the uncanny valley effect. Some suggest that the decrease in affinity is gradual. The valley has sloping sides. Others have found that it was a cliff, with the affinity suddenly dropping at a certain point. There's also research that suggests that younger generations who've grown up with CGI are less likely to experience the uncanny valley effect. But a 2014 study found that children aged between 9 and 11 were still susceptible to its effect. One of the main goals of these studies is to figure out why the uncanny valley effect seems to exist, and if there's a way to overcome it. Some believe that the effect is simply due to how our brains are wired. Studies found that the parts of the brain active when people experience the effect were those involved in processing and evaluating social cues and facial expressions. It could be that our mind is simply trying to put the object into two mutually exclusive categories, human and non-human, because it receives contradicting information. It could also simply be a side effect of our pattern recognition. Humans are very good at recognizing patterns and can tell when something doesn't match the typical pattern, even if our conscious minds are unaware of it. Another theory is that it's entirely evolutionary. There's an eerie theory that suggests humans developed a weariness of beings that look like us but aren't us, and indicates that there was some predator able to perfectly mimic humans. But some scientists and researchers believe that the beings we were trying to avoid were diseased humans. It was a way for our minds to tell us that these were not people that we wanted within our community and to steer clear of them. It may also have been a response to seeing the bodies of people who'd passed away. Even though our ancient ancestors may have wanted to keep the remains of their loved ones with them, these uncanny valley effects would have encouraged them to get away and protect them from the diseases they might spread. Whatever the original cause of the uncanny valley effect, if it exists today, there are many industries trying to overcome it. These range from robotics companies wanting to create a robot that'll be appreciated by most humans, to animators and CGI artists working to create realistic-looking characters that don't put off the audience. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.